Welcome back to another video. It's Dr. Tarcia Hubert here, and in this video we are going to be talking about the translations of the graphs of the sine and cosine functions. So we're still looking at the graphs of cosine functions, except this time we're going to want to move them up, move them down, move them left, and move them right. Okay, so let's talk about how you do that. So the first type of translation we're going to talk about is what we call a phase shift, and a phase shift is a horizontal translation. And that's when you move the graph left or right, okay? And so there is something that affects moving the graph left or right, and that is whenever you add or subtract a number inside the parentheses with the x. Okay, so since we're talking about the graph of sine and cosine, you're either going to have the sine of x minus a number d, or you're either going to have the cosine of x minus a number d. Now, the value of d can be minus or positive, negative or positive, which will change whether this is a negative or a positive number, okay? So we talked about translations in college algebra, if you can remember when you took college algebra, and you talked about those horizontal translations. Well, the same thing happens here. Whenever it's inside the parentheses, it does the exact opposite. And so we call the thing inside the parentheses the argument. So this is the argument, okay? So whenever you are adding a number or subtracting a number in the argument, that's when you move left or right. So now it does the opposite. If you have a minus d, if there's a minus d in here, your graph is going to shift to the right, okay? So if this says minus d, your graph will shift to the right. It does the opposite of what you would think it would do, because your negative numbers, or if you want to get smaller on the x-axis, you go to the left. Well, it actually does the opposite. And then if there is now that should say plus d. Let me make this a plus sign for y'all. I made a mistake, but if there is a plus d, then you will shift to the left. So if it says x plus d in the parentheses, you will shift to the left, okay? I'm going to show you all some graphs on the graphing calculator. So give me 1 second to pull that up. Okay, so I am on desmos.com/calculator. You can see the site in the address bar, but I'm just going to, I already have my functions typed in. I have the sine of x, which we know what the graph of that looks like. But if I subtract pi over 2 in parentheses, what happens is you take all of those points and you shift them to the right, because that's a minus, that's the opposite. It shifts to the right. So this point that was here, 0, 0, is now shifted over pi over 2 units. And so this is pi over 2, 0. Can y'all see that? That's the point pi over 2, 0. That's because we took that point, we shifted it to the right, pi over 2 units, okay? And all of those points will be shifted to the right. So this point, which was pi over 2, 1, now becomes, it's up here, pi 1. So we're moving that x value. We're adding pi over 2 to that x value. So let me show you what happens. I'm going to cut this graph off, the blue graph. And I'm going to show you what happens when you add pi over 2 in the parentheses. So now it takes that original graph, the red graph, and shifts it to the left, pi over 2 units. So this 0, 0 here is now negative pi over 2, 0, because you've taken it and shifted it to the left, pi over 2 units. Now, actually, in this case, it's the same thing if you shift it to the right. That's because it's pi over 2, right? I mean, that's because this is a periodic graph and the way that it falls. But in actuality, what you're doing, in actuality, those are my emails coming through. In actuality, what you're doing is shifting this graph to the left. So every point on the sine function is now shifted left, pi over 2 units, okay? So let's say we wanted to graph a sine function that has a horizontal translation by hand, then we would basically start with our original sine graph. And so our original sine graph has the point 0. If we can remember those, the sine of 0 is 0, the sine of pi over 2 is 1, the sine of pi is 0, the sine of 3 pi over 2 is negative 1, and the sine of 2 pi is 0. Okay, so now basically, since we have a minus pi over 3 here in parentheses, that's going to shift our graph to the right, pi over 3 units. Now, if we shift the graph to the right, that only changes the x values. So all of our y values will stay the same. So this here is the graph of sine x, y equals sine x. Alrighty, now this chart here is going to be for the graph that we're looking for. Alrighty, so all of our y values will stay the same because we're not changing y. But all of our x values will now shift to the right pi over 3 unit. So we will add pi over 3 to each of those x's. So 0 plus pi over 3 is pi over 3. We will do pi over 2 plus pi over 3. You have to find a common denominator. The common denominator would be 6. So I will multiply top and bottom here by 3. And then I will multiply top and bottom here by 2. And that will give me 3 pi over 6 plus 2 pi over 6, which is 5 pi over 6. So I get 5 pi over 6 here. If I do pi plus pi over 3, that gives me 4 pi over 3. So I was just showing you how you add the fractions, right? You got to find a common denominator. And so if you do 3 pi over 2, if you do 3 pi over 2 plus pi over 3, you get 11 pi over 6. That's 11 pi over 6. And then if you do 2 pi plus pi over 3, you get 7 pi over 3. And so all of your x values are changing. And so that is what you would want to plug in. And so I'm just going to put those values over here. So pi over 3. So we have 0, pi over 3. And I know they may not be spaced out right, but pi over 6, 4 pi over 3, 11 pi over 6, and 7 pi over 3. And so we would have at pi over 3, we would have 0. At pi over 6, we would have 1. That's 1. This is negative 1. At 4 pi over 3, we will be back at 0. At 11 pi over 6 would be a negative 1. And 7 pi over 3, we will be back at 0. And so our graph looks like this. That is how we would graph sine of x minus pi over 3. So we took the sine graph and we shifted it to the right pi over 3 units. So that is what you would do for a horizontal translation, and it only affects the x values, okay? So now we want to talk about vertical translation. So vertical translations is when you want to shift the graph up or down. And so what affects the vertical translation is when you add a number to the sine or the cosine function, okay? If you add a number outside of that sine or cosine function, it's going to either move the graph up or down. So now which way does it go? So if the c, if this is a positive number, it shifts the graph up. If that c is negative, less than 0, then it shifts the graph down, okay? So if you add a number, you move it up. If you subtract a number, you move it down. And I want to show you some examples. Alrighty, so here we have the cosine function. I'm going to cut that one on. And I want to do 3 plus the cosine function to show you what happens. So if we add 3, notice, look, each of these points have now shifted up 3. So this was the point 0, 1. If you shift it up 3, it now becomes 0, 4. This was the point pi negative 1. If you shift it up 3, it now becomes pi 2. So when you move the graph up, the y value is changing. Notice the x value stayed the same, but the y values changed. You added 3 to each y value. I'm going to turn the black graph off, and I'm going to do negative 3 plus cosine of x so that you can see if that value is negative, it takes that graph. So here's our original cosine graph, and now it shifts it down 3 units. So that minus 3 or that negative 3 takes each y value and shifts them down 3 units, okay? And so these are your vertical translations, and that's how you move the graph up or down. Okay, so now let's graph one by hand. It says describe the translation and sketch the graph. So the translation is actually the 2. The 2 causes the translation. And since it's being added outside of the x, then that means this is going to shift it up 2. So we'll say the translation is to go up 2. Alrighty. So we will have to start with the original graph of cosine of x. So if I start with cosine x here, the cosine of 0 is 1. Cosine of pi over 2 is 0. Cosine of pi is negative 1. And then 0 and 1. Those are the points from the original cosine graph. Now, if we shift it up 2, it affects the y value. So all of your x values will stay the same. So notice I just brought these same x values over. But what's going to happen is I'm going to add 2 to each of those y values. So I'll do 1 plus 2, which is 3. 0 plus 2, which is 2. Negative 1 plus 2 is 1. 0 plus 2 is 2. And 1 plus 2 is 3. And those are my new y values. And so those are the values that I want to plot. So I'll put 0. Here's pi over 2. Here's pi. Here's 3 pi over 2. And here's 2 pi. This is 1, 2, and 3. So at pi is at 0, we're at 3. At pi over 2, we're at 2. At pi, we're at 1. 3 pi over 2, we're at 2. And 3 and 2 pi, we are back at 3. So our graph does this. So it's the cosine function. It's just shifted up 2 units, okay? So it's that same cosine function, but we've taken it and we've shifted it up 2 units, okay? And so these are your vertical and horizontal translations. If you have any questions about these at all, then put them in the comments below. If not, I'll see you in the next video where I'm going to show you how to graph it when you have a combination of vertical translations, horizontal translations, and you have a change of period and amplitude, okay? So I'll see y'all in the next video. If you haven't already, go ahead and hit that subscribe button for me. Alrighty, thank you.